I have a few announcements first before we start. This lecture is sponsored by Arts Alive series. Our interpreter is Brett Long. We would like to thank the College of Fine Arts and the College of Architecture and Planning, Mr. David Conley, Vietnam War poet, and Mr. Sol Brody, Vietnam War folk singer. Upcoming events include tonight the Northern Kentucky Brotherhood a cappella singer group. It will be at 7 p.m. right here in Emmons Auditorium. Right before our keynote speaker this evening, which would be Elie Wiesel, Nobel Peace Prize winner. The keynote address will be at 8 p.m. Tomorrow, Wayne Leonard, CEO of Energy Power Company, will speak at 10 a.m. in tent number 1. Ruth Dudley Edwards, historian journalist, will also speak in tent number 1 at 6:30 p.m. Keynote address will be Dr. Brian Greene, physicist, string theorist, professor, Columbia University. He'll speak at 8 p.m. in tent number 1. Now for our main event today. The keynote topic is An Afternoon with Maya Lin. It is my honor to present to you our speaker. Maya Lin has won international acclaim for her site-specific art and architecture projects. Since her design for the Vietnam Veteran Memorial in Washington, D.C., which she designed when she was an undergraduate at Yale College, she has gone on to establish herself in both the art and architecture communities. With her unique vision and sensibility, Ms. Lin's work, which has been praised as both serene and profound, embodies the duality of art and architecture, as well as the artist's own Asian American heritage. Critics have praised her works for their ability to bridge between Eastern and Western cultures as they emphasize the personal and private nature of aesthetic experience, creating contemplative places in highly public space. Ms. Lin's sensitivity to aesthetic concern, her innovative approach to site specificity, and her ability to address complex historical and social issues have afforded her a unique place in contemporary art. Maya Lin's art and architecture projects continue to elicit critical acclaim. On an international scale, her work has been featured in publications ranging from Art in America, Connaissance des Arts, and Progressive Architecture to Time and Newsweek. She has also been the subject of a documentary film, Maya Lin, A Strong, Clear Vision, which won the Oscar from the Academy Award of Motion Pictures for Best Documentary in 1995. In 1996, she received the Architecture Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters and the LVMH Foundation's Sciences pour l'Art Award in France. Additionally, she has been the recipient of the Presidential Design Award, the American Institute of Architects Honors Award, and the Henry Bacon Memorial Award. In addition to these prestigious design awards, Ms. Lin is the recipient of honorary doctorate degrees in fine arts from Harvard, Yale, Brown, Smith College, and Williams College. A master designer, a creator of peace. Let's have an afternoon with Maya Lin. Please help me welcome Ms. Maya Lin.
Thank you, Michelle. I guess am I on? Can you hear me? Is it working? Now it's working. I guess, can you hear me now? Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. I almost didn't make it out of my own stupidity. I was at the airplane. I was on the phone. I was sort of doodling or drawing, and I looked over at my gate, and there was nobody there. And they actually had to open the gate for me because I looked so pathetic and so sad that I had just missed my gate. So I'm extremely glad to be here. and I'm going to talk today about sort of more the body of my work. Everything you're going to see except for one project was made in the last 10 years, so basically it's from 89 to 99. There's one school project which I'll talk about, but first I'm going to give just a quick overview. There's something about if you can visually look at it for like less than a second, you don't think about it, you just look. So I'm just going to do a quick overview going from my most current projects built to my earliest, and then I'll go into the projects themselves. So if we could dim the lights, that would be great. A little dimmer, darker. I kind of like it darker. Thank you. Please. More. Perfect. Haley Farm, 1999. Norton Residence, 1998. Detail of that. Untitled Topographic Landscape, 1998. APA Study Center, NYU, 1997. Rockfield, 1997. Stones, 1998. Sounding Stones, 1996. 10 Degrees North, 1996. Wavefield, 1995. Weber House, 1994. Detail of that. Eclipse Time, 1994. Groundswell, 93. Women's Table, 93. Civil Rights, 89. Vietnam Memorial, 81. So I guess I'll start with a student project. And I think, I guess this is in a vertical format. We might have a problem. Because are we going to crop all the vertical formats this way? We might. Anyway, this is the original boards that I submitted for the competition for the Vietnam Memorial. I thought I'd include it here because it was a student project, and I'm sure you all draw much better than me. This one, the quote was from the jury, "He must really know what he's doing to dare to do something this naive." Didn't have a clue, can't draw very well. Anyway, I'm going to talk about it in relation to you do something like this when you're 20-some years old and everyone labels you as an architect because I was in architecture school. But I just want to go back to it. It was a very simple notion to cut open the earth. And I had one of the battles among many, but more an esoteric battle, was that the architects of record at the time were really puzzled as to why I wanted to treat the memorial's walls as a very thin interface. In fact, I wanted the edge condition as narrow as possible. They sort of thought that, like, to be putting in something so substantial, you should express it. You should make it a massive wall, embed it into the earth. And I kept going back to, no, I'm cutting the earth and I'm just polishing the earth. It's a geode, nothing more, nothing less. It's not like I'm adding a form into the earth. I'm merely expressing the act of opening up the earth and polishing the earth's edges. But again, you don't really understand why you do what you do. You have an impulse. And for me, the reflectivity, again, like a geode, we're merely polishing the earth, allowing the names to rest on the surface, creating a dividing line between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And we are going to have a problem. We're going to have a problem because I'm going to be cropping every single vertical side. Is there anything we can do about that before we proceed? Or not really? Well, anyway, on the top and the bottom, obviously with the Vietnam Memorial, I begin and end this piece like an open book. You'll notice that on the left-hand wall, it rags left, and on the right-hand wall, it rags right, exactly like a book. So I've created a book you can read out in the public. And what you can't see is that the beginning and the end of the war meet with the two dates. It begins on the upper right, it ends on the lower left. I've created a closed time circle, which is very different from the next memorial I did, which wasn't until 1989, which was a civil rights memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. It's shrinking. Of which I was called in to design a memorial for civil rights. And my first reaction was no. One, someone has to have done it. And two, again, I was very gun-shy of getting typecast. But when I found out that nothing had been done on a national level, once more, something sort of impelled me. I think I'm very interested in history, and in our nation's history, especially things that were going on when I was a child, the women's movement, the Vietnam War, the civil rights struggles. And I remember coming across a fact that in 1963, a man was killed for using a whites-only bathroom. And I was stunned because I was born in '59. I knew nothing about the war at home. I knew more about the Vietnam-era war than I did about what was happening in our own backyard, and I realized how quickly we can lose history if it's not taught. So for me, as opposed to listing just names, because in a way names here would not mean as much, it became my goal to create a very brief history of the civil rights era, intertwining people's deaths with key events, like it starts with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. It ends with Martin Luther King's assassination in '68. Here, the civil rights movement was a people's movement. One person, Rosa Parks, refusing to give up her seat, started an entire push. And by relating people's deaths with legislative events, it turns out to have a causal effect. And sometimes one person can affect change. Other times a riot led to someone's death, led to better legislation. And so as you walk around, and this one I left a gap because the civil rights era, we can sort of, I let the historians claim a time period. They sort of chose that, they chose the key facts. But the gap signifies the space before and the space after that we can never, that is still commemorated here, but we couldn't begin to list all. But again, could I give people a brief history of that time? And so that's the piece. And the dates do walk around in a clockwise fashion. And then the quote, if I can focus it a little, comes from Martin Luther King, quoting from the book of Amos, "We are not satisfied, we shall not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water." So that in a way speaks to the future, speaks to, this piece is at the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama, speaks to their goals, sort of in a way that we can, this is about the past and that signifies the future. But again, time is a very key element in these two pieces. And this is just showing what I was given, the original site of the building, and how I think they wanted me to come in and sort of put a stone after the first set of stairs, and I sort of came in and I said, well, can I just take out your whole front entry? Which I did. And essentially by pushing everything off center, asymmetry is another thing that plays up in what I do a lot. I wanted to begin to even suggest that things don't have to be symmetrical, things don't have to look equal to be balanced. I call it asymmetrical balancing. And that basically comes down to the shape of the piece itself, which is extremely cantilevered. And then, of course, the text and how it ends. But once more, it's the play of time. And so from the Vietnam, it was a closed circle. From this one, it's slightly open-ended. And the last piece is of the monuments. You want to call this one, it's not really a monument. The women's table at Yale, I was brought in to commemorate women at Yale, and what did that mean? I had no idea. But I just started with a little sketch, and sometimes I start with models, other times I start with sketches. I obviously knew, unlike the two other timelines that in a way had a specific time and a specific closure, commemorating a beginning, there is no end. So I chose a spiral to connote time here. And the spiral grew into an idea of numbers. And that grew into a model that I made. A lot of times I'll study a project for months and months and months, and sort of know, okay, it's going to have a spiral, it's going to have some conceptual idea of time, but have no idea what the form is. And then I'll wake up one morning and just quickly make a model. And oftentimes that becomes the piece. It's just sort of the way I work. It's a 14-foot piece of one piece of stone. And on its top, and people can sit around it, and it's a fountain, is a spiral of numbers. And the numbers start with zeros and they go down into the hole. And you can begin to see a date. The first date I think you see is 1890. The first women to enter Yale entered in about the 1880 or 1870s. Actually, they entered the School of Art there. And it counts the number of women enrolled at Yale from when there were none to the day I put the piece in 1993. And what you see is a very specific factual accounting in time, but what it relates to is a larger picture of sort of the emergence of women, I think, in the workforce, in society as a whole. The choice of numbers was because when Yale first went co-ed, they did so with a very, very tight quota system. And it was a highly contentious debate because they would have let some women enter, but not if it interfered with the fact that they needed to graduate 1,000 Yale men every year. And so in a way, the tokenism was very sorely felt. So I kind of wanted to point out the sort of the contention, the fact that we were counted this way. Another fact is there were many women at Yale in the graduate school who never were counted, and they were called silent listeners. So in a way, I really wanted to politically kind of count us in that sense. And I guess this is a good piece because I've got to commemorate like my time there too, because I'm in there for like 7 years, which is kind of fun. But so time plays throughout my work, and this is a piece I completed in 1993 in Penn Station. I had to do an artwork for the Long Island Railroad section where like 50,000, I don't know how many thousands of people walk through there on a daily basis. So how do you make a work of art? You can't touch it, you can't sit on it, it can't get in the way, it can't interfere. Especially with me, I'm an environmental artist. I want to create something spatial. And so I decided to create sort of a solar eclipse in the ceiling. And also, I'm very site specific, but the site's not just a physical site. So what do commuters always worry about? Time. And for this one, the disc, the solid disc, I don't know if you can make it out, I don't know if I have another slide of it. The solid disc on the far right travels back and forth. And the light source is directly above you. It's a fiber optic array. At 12 midnight, the solid disc completely eclipses the light source. At 12 noon, it's either going to be to the far left or the far right. And the clock is fairly accurate to, say, the 15-minute mark. And so that piece is eclipse time. And again, it's what I would call a hybrid piece. It's half art, half architecture. And I'm always sort of struggling between the architecture side of me. I'm sort of solidly trained as an architect for 7 years, but I've always equally been drawn to the sculpture. And I think this is a piece that pretty much merges the two in a way, the way the monuments do. The monuments have a function, but their function is a purely symbolic one. And so this one's another one of the hybrids. And I'm also about to install another sculpture at Stanford University, which also deals with time. You can see an inner metal circle that is a second hand, another round disc which goes around every hour. The whole inner part of the circle makes a rotation every hour. All the numbers on the outside array correlate it back to universal time coordinates, because this will go into their science computer quad area. And I wanted to talk about time in terms of a much more relative use of time and the UTC coordinates. What you will never notice is that the whole piece of stone, it's 11 feet in diameter, is slowly rotating. And the piece makes one complete rotation every year. And it's another water table, and its center rotation point is off center. So in June, it's going to push way out on one side, but by July, it's going to be pushed out way on the other. And so I don't know why I have this fascination with with time is one of the key aspects. A lot of times I think in the monuments and in these hybrid works. The other side of me, at the same time I was doing the Vietnam Memorial, which again was an impulse to cut open the earth, just kept going back to the land. And I'm going to go through a sequence of projects that sort of are working towards that. A piece I did in New Haven when I was a graduate student. I went back to Yale after finishing the Vietnam Memorial. It was a piece called Aligning Reeds, and they occurred at a bend in the river. And they looked like a random placement of reeds, painted metal rods. And then at one point, exactly from the opposite side of the stream where there was a bend in the river, they all lined up. And then they went back to being random. And I was out there one day after I'd put it in, and there were some fishermen hanging out there, and they were kind of scratching their heads, and they were kind of wondering what it was, and they couldn't quite tell if it was real or what it was. And then they just, I didn't expect it, they turned around and said, "Well, do you know what it is?" And I said, "No." And I walked away. But again, I never knew what I was going to do. And then as I was doing the Civil Rights Memorial, which again is a very urban-sided piece, just like the Women's Table is a very urban-sided piece, and I responded. I am very site-specific in a much more, I think, formal way, or a way that is very conceptual due to the fact that they are memorializing something. The other side of me, I think there is sort of a split in me, again, keeps getting drawn back to the land. And so when I was doing the civil rights, I was, for a friend, doing a very small project in Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania. And I came to the site, and you can see in the rear, in the background, a very large hill, which is where I first stood, and I knew I wanted to they wanted a gathering space outside and an open-air chapel. But from that site, that big open hill, I sensed there was someone watching, or there was a way of looking out. So I walked up to the top of this hill into the woods, and I felt a connection sort of between a private notion of gathering and a public notion of gathering. So those are the two links. And I created a 4-foot diameter ring of stone, embedded it into the moss in the woods, but from this vantage point, when you're by yourself, you can look out and see the larger circle, which is just a 40-foot diameter ring of stone, cut in and dished. And it was about a notion of sort of splitting yourself up into a private and public self. And then right after that, I started to move towards more landscape pieces. This is a site in Charlotte, North Carolina, in front of their sports coliseum, where they expected an artwork right at the top. Right? You can sort of see it at the top. I wish I had a pointer. And I was working with a landscape architect, Henry Arnold, and all we could think about is this 60-foot wide, 1,600-foot long space that was not being used, surrounded by a sea of cars, and it dropped 60 feet over its length. And I sort of found it irresistible. So the idea of throwing a game down the hill, and that turned into topo. And the game also was pushing what earth was there around, not adding, not subtracting, just, shoveling the earth and creating an imaginary game. And the hills became quite steep in order to roll, and it all ends in a spiral hole-in-one. And then we introduced the topiary into it. And it was, 89 to 90 was this piece. And you've just got to understand, this is probably one of the first works I was doing that did not deal with memorials. And it was a real breakthrough for me because it was getting me back to the landscape. And also doing something that is very, very much a part of my upbringing in southeastern Ohio, which is the sort of the Hopewell and Adena serpent mounds, the burial mounds. I think there's some around here in Indiana, but they were very, very much a part of my childhood, as well as I'm from very southeastern Ohio, where the hillscape is very, very much rolling, beautiful hills. It's sort of a surreal, this is an odd, surreal shot of it, and then the rolling down the hill. So obviously, all my childhood these serpent mounds, these burial mounds, this is Mound City outside of Columbus, were just, you'd run into them in a field. And it's sort of funny what will influence you in later life, but I've always been fascinated by these effigy mounds. And so in a way, I think Topo is a blending of that with sort of a French topiary garden, but taking what was normally a very classical situation and making it very free-flowing. This piece then led to another piece, which the Wexner Center for the Arts, Peter Eisenman's building, the director, or the curator there, Sarah Rogers, called me in. As I've been working, I was also developing in my studio smaller scaled sculptures in lead, beeswax, broken glass. Inherently, they couldn't go out of doors, especially the broken glass. And I think Sarah brought me in asking me, could I begin to merge? Could I begin to take some of my indoor studio sculptures outside? And I started looking around the Wexner Center, and I started, Eisenman's building, by combining two grids, creates all these residual spaces or unplanned spaces. And all of a sudden I knew that I could use broken glass, visibly accessible but physically inaccessible. And for the first time, the nature of making art in public places is there are certain rules, certain limitations. Say broken glass, which I can easily put in a museum, much harder to find a home out of doors. You wouldn't believe how many artworks are influenced by whether they can mow it or not. It's silly little things like that, but they come into play. And it's probably one of the reasons why it is so hard, I think, to create art in a public, in an out-of-door space where anyone can enter. But anyway, another idea for me in this piece, which is groundswell, was that I would not plan it. Unlike anything we do in architecture or in the large-scale artworks, which involve many models, many drawings, a team of engineers, consultants, contractors. Most of the time when I walk into the studio, I'm making these pieces by myself. And there's a simultaneity involved in that, and can I capture that in making a very large-scale piece? And that, again, was another goal. So other than this sketch, or that sketch, that's all I did. And I ordered 43 tons of car glass. And it showed up one day, and I had 2 weeks to make the piece in full view. And I think there was a real challenge there, but it also was, when you make a work of art, how far can you plan it? And can you, when you make a painting, though you might do sketches, you're going to physically make that painting very directly by yourself. When you inherently draw it up, study it, engineer it, make models, and then let someone else build it along the way, would you have changed it? Would you have been allowed to have changed it? Architecture especially, this is a big question, because we can't, and especially with the way the industry is, we can't afford to. They won't, what we change order in the field is very different. So with this project, I really wanted to see, could I physically go out there and make a very large-scale piece without much pre-planning. And so we were out there for like a week, I think. And it's in 3 levels. The upper level, only the offices see, and it's the most formal. The middle level is just sort of a pour piece. This piece has a life, it's loose glass, so it sort of acts like a Japanese raked garden. They do repoint it, and they do it every year. So it is the life expectancy, or whatever the term of a school academic year. But it's a gravity piece. And then that's the middle piece. This is what you see when you walk into the building. And then that is from the main cafeteria, which, if you can remember, was a 8-foot deep concrete moat. And this was a real breakthrough for me, because for me, I felt I was getting back into something that was so much about where I wanted to be sculpture-wise. And I knew that I had made my first work of art. Because in a way, I've always felt the monuments are these hybrid creatures. And part of me was just still struggling to make works of art. And so this is Groundswell, and it was, I think, in 1993. That's how it's seen in the snow. And I think we're going to switch to the next carousel now, right? No. Thanks. We're just going to switch to the next carousel if you can do it. Now, keeping in mind that that's sort of one part of me, at the same time period as I was making an artwork for the Wexner Center, I was also designing the Museum for African Art in New York. So I basically was balancing two different sides. One, I'm making a work of art in Peter Eisenden's building. Two, I'm making a building for artwork to be in. So the Museum for African Art is a 12,000 square foot space in Manhattan, interior, where I basically created a bit of a mythic journey going through here. You ascend through the dark stair, you come up into the light through the yellow stair. The yellow stair is opposite the darkest room in the museum, which is a hand-dyed indigo boutique room, the midnight room. And your entrance is past sort of night and day, kind of creating a mythic, a passage, which is what I thought a museum should be. I made some very hand-drawn spaces, which are the stairs, which is the reception area. Again, the presence of the hand-drawn, I actually went on site with my crew and drew parts of the stair so that as you walk down them, you'd in a way feel the handmade or the presence of the human hand. And that's just that piece. And that's how the stair ended up. And again, the indigo room and the stair you descend to the lower level. And one of the things is that we kind of call some African objects art, and others in the shop they would sell as artifact, and yet we as a second culture taking over. So I kind of wanted to play off of that and highlight the museum pots in a similar deference for their shape, and as I am the actual works of art as you walk by, sort of the cutouts in the stairwell indicate that. And then at the same time that I was doing this project, I was working on a house in Massachusetts, which has that's the steps into the garden, and looking from the study to that entranceway. And just a sort of a free-form, open plan, views back to the garden, views out to the mountains, and then the curve of the roof connecting everything, and in a way mimicking the landscape around it. And so this is 94, and simultaneous to this, I'm working on a project for University of Michigan called Wave Field, where I was brought in by the Aerospace Engineering Building to create an artwork. And again, being site-specific, I didn't quite know what I was going to do. Their building was just about to be built, and I started studying about flight and fluid dynamics, and at some point I hit this picture. It's called a Stokes water wave. It's a naturally occurring wave pattern that is fairly repetitive. And I knew the piece would be about that. And so I started building up model after model, and I was trying to figure out how to begin one wave and end another, and I couldn't figure it out. And so I just, in the end, had got it roughly gridded out, and then we went out and I finessed everything with the crew on site. And that's how it looks now. And they mow it with little 6-inch mowers. It's the Aerospace Engineering. We kept thinking we'd have a competition for a hovercraft lawnmower one day. But it changes. You get to see this from up above, and there is an Escher-esque quality to it. It changes very substantially with how the light passes over it. And again, you can sort of see my whole progression through towards landscape moves. And I think this is one of my favorite pieces. And that's sort of how it looks like. One of the professors flew over it and took that picture. But at the same time, I was working on a piece for the Rockefeller Foundation, which as you walk in, you see this, and you don't know what it is. It's a water table, but it's cut stone. And only from the second level do you realize it's a map of the world, with the water level actually, water's percolating up from the various trenches, the Japan Trench, the Puerto Rican Trench. And in doing a sculpture for the Rockefeller Foundation, it's called 10 Degrees North, I created an installation that included the bamboo planters that go through the walls to various stone tables. Each table has a different image inscribed, the mosquito signifying their work in the health field. They helped eradicate, when they've worked on the Anopheles, this is Anopheles gambia mosquito, which causes malaria. To this is a musical score from Tanglewood, which represents the arts. And when I was doing this piece, though I was working with landscape, and the title of the piece, 10 Degrees North, actually bears witness to the fact that the projection I used is 10 degrees north of the equator. Because politically, when we look at a map, a rectangular projection map, everything distorts as it goes to the north and south poles. Since there's more landmass in the northern hemisphere towards the northern poles, we have an idea that Asia and North America are much larger than they actually are. So inherently, all maps are political. If you buy a map in China, it has China at the center. Maps from America, Europe, have have the Atlantic Ocean hole, which makes Europe look a lot larger than it actually is. And so I basically decided I'd look at projections from different points in the equator, and I settled on 10 degrees north because it balanced things out. But this piece, actually, I was sort of searching for something that wouldn't be so fitted into its environment. I actually liked the architecture of the building, and so I ended up making a piece that in a way I felt was as much designed into the space, and I thought it wasn't as successful because of that. And so my next piece, which I did, was in a Helmut Jahn building, which I was much less sympathetic to. And it was a very corporate lobby upstairs with double height glass walls, and then a lower level lobby, and I decided to crack open the lower level lobby wall, and it's called A Shift in the Stream. And the idea of taking a rivers and just cutting it into a building. In other words, could I take what I normally do with my outdoor earthworks and treat architecture as my site and excavate a building? And so these are all just early studies, just a drawing, what would that break look like? And so physically I went out there with a crew and we broke fragments of the wall and then plastered it back in. Water runs inside, and it's called A Shift in a Stream. This is the lowest level. And up above, there are 12 jets of water, and they randomly allow the water to trickle down the inside of the lobby. And in a way, I found this much more successful because I was able to create a naturally occurring phenomena or a landscape work within an architectural site, have it mesh, not physically clash, but in a way subvert that building and not work like an architect and not think like an architect. Because I think oftentimes by splitting the art and the architecture, if I design an artwork, I'm going to kill it, and I'm going to kill its inspiration. So I'm always sort of battling because I end up doing both the art and the architecture. And then here's just another project I finished. A couple years ago, it's called Reading a Garden. I collaborated. I work with text a lot, and you can see it's backwards, but then it reads forwards, reflected. The title reads forwards in the water at the heart of the garden. So it begins to clue you in that this piece is going to be about the directionality and weight of words. And I collaborated with my brother, who's a language poet. In other words, he does not use a narrative approach, and so we had to you had to be able to read this card and coming in from 3 entrances. So, words follow in a maze, me, a fountain, or you can read it the other way. And then that's sort of how it looks. It's for the Cleveland Public Library. And this one's verses run rhymes around reversed verses, run rhymes around reversed verses, but of course it reads back and forth with the shadows reversed. And then, ends up at the water's edge. And it's just, again, time is one element I use a lot, water is another. And at the same time, I was creating my first sculpture installation. It's called Topologies. And this is, in the foreground, it's untitled Topographic Landscape out of particle board, avalanche of 14-ton glass pour pieces in the background. And this was my first attempt at being able to bring the earthwork aesthetic inside to a museum location, to a non-built-in, site-specific permanent piece. So this show traveled to 6 locations. Actually, this piece is now in Budapest. And another part of that show was Phases of the Moon, which is a series of oblique poured wax pieces that get steeper and steeper, and then the shadow on the wall sort of forms an eclipse situation. And this is a series of 45 blown glass pieces in mimicking a natural rock and how complex such a simple shape is. And then this is an asteroids grouping. And then these are from a series called Flatlands, which is where I inked a plate of glass, broke it, and ran it through the press. And it's as much a mapping, sort of reminiscent of, this one sort of reminds me of a map of the United States. But again, everything is sort of about natural formations. This is an ice cave I visited. This is a glacial pattern. So most of my artwork is coming from a studied look at landscape, but it's a landscape seen through a technological camera view. And this is called Ecliptic, which is cast pewter. And then what was interesting to me is this is when, up until this point, I think I was a little afraid that there would be a schism between the art and the architecture. And simultaneous to the earth is to topologies, I had to put up my first group of furniture for Knoll. I ended up calling the furniture collection The Earth is Not Flat. And these are a grouping of stools called stones with ever so slightly concave tops out of concrete. The chairs are east and west latitude. They're off-center. You either lean to the left or lean to the right. And the tabletop is ever so slightly convex. And then the chair is called longitude. And so I'm beginning to introduce more and more the landscape aesthetic into the design work. And I think then we'll go to the last group of slides. Can I get the last group of slides, please? And it leads to the last grouping, which is the architecture. And this is a piece of furniture I designed for an apartment in New York. And it's a puzzle. And the dining room table opens up. And the apartment itself, it's for an art collector, again, opens up. This is the entry hall. You can either go down to the public areas or up to the private areas with screens flipping out. And this is a view from the living room to the kitchen. And the whole stairway is held up by a half-inch plate of steel. And the kitchen, you can begin to see in the foreground the dining room table, which closes up completely, or the buffet, the island, which closes up into a box, or the kitchen, which disappears completely. The design problem for this one was I was hired by someone who wanted to surprise his wife. And he would give no other direction. And knowing who he was, I just decided to give him a bit of a toy puzzle, something that was simple, not too high-tech, but that would open up and reveal itself if you cared to figure out what was going on. Sort of there was a mystery to it, a game being played out. So this is the upstairs in diagram. You can see it closed, and you can see it open on the right-hand side, where it transforms itself from a 3-bedroom, 2-bath to a 2-bedroom, 1-bath by sliding panels And on the right-hand side, on both plans, you can see a closet, a very large wardrobe, very easily pivots and slides up against the wall, which is this little unit, which can sort of rotate. And also, in order to do this, little details had to happen, like a triple hinge had to be done so all the doors would fit and close perfectly. And this is sort of the bathroom as it's in the open position. So they're basically two bathrooms. It's a large two-bathroom suite, one bathroom suite or two smaller bathrooms. And then this is the shower shut and the shower open. So everything disappears into the walls. So it's in a way built like a ship or a toy, a transformer toy or origami is how I sort of imagined it. And then at the same time I was working on a Asian American Center for NYU. A lot of times I work for not-for-profits in the architecture, so the budgets are very limited, and usually the time frames are even worse. This was one of those, but the idea of they needed to create an Asian American department where basically every professor in it would be interdepartmental. So they technically didn't need real offices here. What they wanted was a gathering space for Asian American students throughout the college to come and gather. So I gave them a gallery at the heart, and to get light into it, I made the whole wall translucent, which you can sort of see the director going, this is reverse. I boo-booed on the director, whatever. But anyway, those are shadowy lights and books from the offices beyond, and then it faces the main gallery. And at the same time, I worked on a library for the Children's Defense Fund. This is inside an existing Tennessee 1800s cantilevered barn. I was brought down to Clinton, Tennessee, to the Children's Defense Fund, and they wanted a library on site, and they also wanted a chapel, which I'll get to in a second. And I thought, what are you using this barn for? And they really didn't know. And so I decided to recycle the old barn. The reason it's raised up, I think, is because they were in floodplains, and this was a way to keep the hay dry. But it allowed me to create one crib as an entrance into the building, one crib as a bookstore. And at the center point, this is a very odd picture from God photography shot, there was a void. It's a very low space between the two buildings. It's only 7 feet high. The library itself is only 2,000 square feet overall, so every space counted. So I put a sculpture at the entranceway and created an outdoor room to increase sort of this entrance into the building. So this is what meets you before you even enter the building. And then to get into the building proper, I left the outside raw and just sawed into the crib, and then left it very apparent that I was sort of going to start something very new on the inside, like an inside skin on a very old exterior. And then the inside is completely skinned with maple particle board and glass. And that's walking up, where the shadow of the old crib is visible, and I played with the lighting so that and it's all fluorescent lighting in the slits. Just a lot of the Norton, all the behind the glass there was all fluorescent for energy efficiency. And then cutting a skylight in where the reading carrels are is also where the main entry crib is. And then that's going up to the main reading room, which faces a pond. Outside that window is a pond, which you can see from here. And right now I'm working on the chapel, which is about a 4,000, 5,000 square foot gathering space for the Children's Defense Fund, which also, you can see it in the upper left, will face this pond. So I'm in a unique position in time to create something new and work within something old on this site, and taking the motto of the Children's Defense Fund, Dear Lord, be good to me. The sea is so wide and my boat is so small. I want to create a wooden boat. I think contextually everything on their site is a wooden log cabin structure. How can I introduce something completely new and yet keep it in context? And I just came up with wanting to make a boat, a very clean boat, no parapet around the roof, and then have been starting to work on the core support, and I've just simplified it to a wood box and a stone box, separated by a terrace, a gridded terrace canopy that will play off of the grid of the apple orchard trees. So I'm currently working on this one. And then another project that is being worked on right now is another landscape piece for the city of Grand Rapids, which is a 4-acre park whose centerpiece is an elliptical gathering space, which in the wintertime becomes a skating rink. And it was construction started in the year 2000, so to commemorate that, at the bottom of the skating rink will be an array of the midnight sky on January 1, 2000. And so that's going in right now. So, and the thing about it is though you always intuitively know water is flat, the way the amphitheater steps are laid out at a tilt, you'll feel like you're skating on a tilted plane. So it plays again off of sort of a change of perception or the curvature of the earth or something that'll slightly send you maybe a little off balance. And that's how it sets up. And then the last project, which I end my book with it, is another project that I'm starting up, and it's on extinction. And I don't know if you can read it, but if you can imagine a monument that isn't just in one place, but in many places at once, and also in a non-site, such as the internet, which will connect all the sites, I'm beginning to work on with a group of scientists a project that will focus on biodiversity and extinction. And I think for me it's very personally close to where I am. And I've managed to be very fortunate and have worked on issues on gender equality, racial equality, what war is. And for me, my one true love and concern is the environment. So I really want to look into, and if I can do something that focuses on, we are in the 6th largest extinction, and the only extinction being caused by one species, as opposed to sort of a geologic event. And so I'm working with Yellowstone right now because they're our first national park, and my sort of dream is to help make Antarctica our first international park, because I think if we're going to solve this problem, it's going to be solved on a global level. So this is sort of one of the, I begin a lot of my artworks with an idea on paper, and it's always a verbal, not a sketch. I think sometimes when you find a form too soon, it doesn't quite fit. So oftentimes I will begin with writing. So this is sort of one more project that I'm starting with this fall. And that's it. So we want to turn the projector off and turn the lights up, and I'll take any questions if anyone has any questions. Any questions? See one person out there. I can't see you, but. Considering I was probably your age when I designed that piece, what I've been trying to do in this lecture is to say, in a way, I got pegged as an architect, and I thought I was an architect. Not that I don't love making buildings, but I am absolutely much more of an artist who happens to build buildings. My whole approach to making work, everything is really more as an artist. I grew up in a college campus. My dad was Dean of Fine Arts, but my mother was much more the academic, so I went more the academic route maybe. It probably took me a good 10 years after Vietnam to realize that where I stand and the discovery through all those earthworks. And that's something that I think it's very dangerous if you get pegged or you peg yourself as to who you are, when really you're in formation. What I'm trying to say here is that was 20 years ago, and it's taken me 20 years to kind of discover where I'm very comfortable with. And I'm glad I didn't because I think 15 years ago when I first got to New York, there were people who wanted me to show work, and I knew I wasn't ready. And if I had shown, I again would have gone public with stuff that I think would have been much younger information. And so I tended to hermit away. And that's what I do. I'll just disappear into my studio if I feel that's what I need to do for a while. But I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I think you always want to, I always want to be searching. And I think in that search, you really don't know where you're going to end up.
The Ohio State campus at the Wexner Center, where you put everything in there, you said you were out there for quite some time. I'm sure
2 weeks.
2 weeks. You got a chance to kind of hear some of the responses or the reactions from students as they walked by, unless you did in the summer. What were their reactions, and how does that affect you and your work?
At the time that I put it in, someone brought a class out to watch me as I was working, which was incredibly unnerving. That's when I realized, what am I doing? Because you can't transfer a private studio method of working to, or can you? But the reality is, once I started pouring, it didn't matter who was there. As far as the responses afterwards, except for the fact that it's my only piece in my own home state that ever got vandalized. And the middle piece got vandalized so badly that I remade it. And I didn't want to recreate because the whole thing was unplanned, so I didn't want to put in. So I put in a different piece. I thought people liked it, but basically someone had a lot of magenta pigment, which magenta is a color that was very sympathetic, like it was the complement to the blue, if you want to look at it that way. So someone had planned something and waited for a good heavy rain, because it destroyed the piece, it was actually very upsetting at the time when it happened. I was very, it was a very violent act, actually, and but it was also like, okay, I'm just going to remake it. So the minute I heard, I said, take it out of there because I don't want to give that person satisfaction. And so they cleaned it out, and I came back like a month later and did another piece. But I don't know. I think people like it. I don't know.
You have a very hands-on approach with your sculpture. I wonder, do you take the same approach when you're doing something with a building?
Yes and no. I think I'm not licensed. I will always work with teams of architects. I have a very small studio. I have, at the most, right now I have 3 assistants, 2 trained in art, 1 trained as an architect. One of the ones who's trained in art also was trained in architecture. Sort of like, because it's hard to get people that have both shared sensibilities. Anything visual, I will design, sometimes down to the hinges. And I love that aspect of architecture. I won't take on many projects for that reason. And if anything, if you want to stay small in architecture, it's actually a very difficult, and you basically have to say no to a lot, because the time it takes to do one building and the amount of energy to fully detail it to the degree that I enjoy doing it, I'm just not going to take on a lot of projects. And if I do, I'm going to have fun with it. No. I am. I have the unfortunate good luck of. Well, what can I? Yes, I did design part of my apartment in New York. Part of it is a Gothic Tudor old library of a school, which is the lower level, and then you go upstairs and it's completely new and it's mine. So there's a weird little whatever. The irony is that when I got married, my husband, who loves design, had 12 years ago commissioned Ettore Satsas to design his house in Colorado. So when I was getting engaged, I told a friend who knew about this house, and he just started laughing, because it's very rare that one living architect has to live in another living architect's house to that degree. Luckily, the house isn't as Memphis as Etre's furniture is, and it's a fairly solid modernist plan. But it's ironic. It's very rare that this happens. Anyone else?
You said, I think, that it's not good, or often not good, to come to a form too soon.
Yeah.
Could you explain that a little more?
I think, especially in design, what I tend to like to do is I like to understand my goals, my parameters, verbally. I think oftentimes if I start doodling, I fall in love with the little shape, and then I try to stuff the function into the shape. You just do it. It's automatic. So the longer I can keep myself from making those shapes, in other words, the longer I might study who the people are, what the site is, what my goals are. Sometimes I'll study it for 6 months, not touch anything for 3 months, and then start drawing or making a model. So, I think there's a disconnect that goes on when you make things, and I think you can research something, and you can research something, and you can analyze something, but it is not a scientific search. And at some point, you have to stop thinking and just make something. But I like that stopping thinking and that intuitive making after I've maybe done a lot of research for 3 months. But I also like to separate them so that after having done that research, I let it just sort of, what I do is I percolate. It just sits in there. And people start getting really worried because they don't know if they're ever going to hear from me again. And I basically try very hard never, ever to work on deadline. No, there's bad news after this. For the artwork, I have yet to meet one client in architecture where, well, actually there was one. The apartment in New York was a non-deadline piece, the surprise for the wife. But other than that, architecture tends to work on deadline, so again, we're always playing catch-up. But for the artwork, I absolutely say, no, you've just got to trust, this is my process, because I absolutely don't want to have come up with that idea because supposedly something was due on such and such a date. Architecture, you will rarely have that leisure because of the economy of how the building industry works.
I want to first thank you for designing the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. How many have seen it? It's quite an emotional experience. And I had the pleasure of handling the media relations for the groundbreaking for the Jan Scruggs and the American Legion. But being a veteran of World War II, I wish we had the same kind of memorial for World War II. Would you comment on the one that they're planning?
From what I've seen, and more what I've heard, and I've literally just seen a clip this big of the site plan, I basically haven't focused on it. I think it's a highly problematic and highly charged site. I think as far as its design, again, I feel a little like not quite, I've heard from a lot of people whose opinions I do trust, who really feel that aesthetically its siting is tough from where it stands, and also the sort of the stylistic of the architecture seems a little tough. I mean, but again, I've literally just seen a clip this big, so it's sort of I don't feel comfortable commenting. What about you? Have you seen it? I assume you've seen it.
I prefer yours.
Thank you. Thank you. It is a small miracle that what I designed ever got built. It is a fluke of flukes. If you know how Washington works, it is an impossibility that thing. When I was selected, put yourself in my place, you know about competitions, you know what happens in competitions, nothing ever gets built the way it's drawn or designed. You go down to Washington with a black below grade project. I knew the thing wasn't going to get built. So the biggest surprise for me was groundbreaking. Or no, not groundbreaking, dedication. Because it came out pretty pure to what I had envisioned. That is, it shouldn't have happened under a Reagan administration with Perot and Watt. So, anyway.
Thank you very much, Maya. Ms. Lin will have a book signing right outside in the lobby. And also I want to remind you, if you'd like to see the pieces of furniture, they're on exhibit in the architecture gallery in the architecture building. Thank you very much.
Thank you.